Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I hope that you're enjoying LTUE, learning a lot at this conference. I know that I always do. And welcome to your Friday evening. My name's Troy Lambert. If you haven't seen me around yet, I'm a freelance writer, author, editor, and co-owner of a small niche publishing business. But tonight, what we're going to talk about is perfect series planning to prevent stalls and burnout. Now, I want to talk to you about this topic. First of all, this is going to be a two-part topic. So we're going to talk about it for about 45 minutes here. We're going to kind of lay the foundation and go into really the first steps of writing your series. And then following that, we'll take a little bit of a break, and then we'll come back and go into depth with the last part of planning your series. And then I'll stick around after that for questions, just to let you know kind of what to expect. Now, the reason I am passionate about talking about this particular topic is because, first of all, I love writing series. Series are a blast. I feel like they're easier to write in many cases than standalone novels. And as far as commercially, they just tend to do better. You tend to make more money from a series than you do from standalone novels. That is not always the case, and I'm sure someone can prove me wrong, but this is just the way things typically work. I'm going to also, during this time, I'm going to use a software that I use to outline series and to outline my books. It's called Plotter. Full disclosure, I'm going to post a resources link when we're done with this session, and when we're done with the second one as well. And that goes to a place on my website that basically gives you some resources for plotting and things like that, including that as Plotter. And some of the resources on that page are things I have affiliate links to. I absolutely love Plotter, so I actually work with them and for them a lot in presentations, but you don't have to use Plotter to use these methods. You can use these methods with any software that you're comfortable with. I've seen people do it in Excel, to do it in Word docs, Google Docs. I happen to write in Scrivener, outline in Plotter. If you're a person that outlines and writes in Scrivener, that is fantastic. What this is more about is the methods that you can use to plan your series so that basically you don't burn out, you don't give up, and you don't quit. Now, also, before we get started, after my full disclosure about that, it is also confession time. I have a series that I started to write with another author. We had a very ambitious publishing plan, a very ambitious writing plan. We had all these plans to get ahead of the game and be way ahead of having books written and having them just prepared to sail out the door when they were ready for publishing and things like that. And that did not work out. Essentially, we burned out. He had things going on in his life that were interfering with his writing time, making it difficult for him to get his portion of the work and his portion of the books done. We were editing things at the last minute, writing things at the last minute, waiting for each other to do things. We hadn't blended our writing styles well enough to decide how the books were going to look, so some of them looked very different. And so we actually ended up burning out. So we ended up slowing the series way down. I took over the series so he could focus on his family and those issues. And then I slowed the series way down, releasing books a lot further apart, taking more time to edit them and make sure that they were right, and to do all those various different things. And it's not that that series has not been a success. It doesn't continue to be a success. Is essentially we have a lot of audiobooks out at this point. It's actually a really great series, but it did produce some burnout and some friction, and that made things unpleasant. One of the reasons I wanted to do this presentation was I want to save you from the things that have happened to me. You don't have to burn out on a series. You can keep going on a series. You can plan it out well enough that you have a pathway to success. And I'm hopefully going to lead you through that. Now, the series I'm going to use that I'm going to talk about as an example is basically that series. It's called the Capital City Murders series. It's really easy to understand the basic premises. There's a photographer, freelance photographer, Nick O'Flanagan. He's been assigned by Travel USA magazine to travel all around the country to every single state capital. He has 1 week in each one in which to take pictures of the Capitol building and the surrounding areas in the Capitol to give those that are going to read this book eventually a flavor for the city and for the area. And then it's going to be created into this huge Travel USA coffee table manual. But everywhere that Nick goes, he runs into a mystery. And because he's very detail oriented, he's a macro photographer, he always notices details that other people don't that help him to solve this mystery. So it's a combination of kind of a travel log mystery type thing with an amateur sleuth who solves crimes wherever he goes. And of course, this causes him various different problems and things like that along his journey. Okay, as far as a premise, it's a very, very simple premise. It's a very simple, big idea of the book. And then each book, of course, we had to come up with a mystery, and there's a lot of alliteration, overdoses in Olympia, slaying in Salem, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll see those as we go through. So I'm going to use that series as an example of how to plan a series. And I'm going to tell you about some of the things we did wrong and how we should have done them better and how you can do better than what we did. So let's dive right in. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lay a foundation. Okay, I'm going to lay a foundation for what a series looks like, what makes up a series, and so how you decide, is this idea the right one for a series? And is this a series I want to write? Okay, because that is really important. So the first thing we're going to talk about is ideas. So there are two types of ideas. So if you talk to most writers, they will tell you that, me included, that I have enough ideas that I can write from now until the day that I die and never run out of ideas to write about. I have enough ideas for novels and series and novellas and short stories and things like that I will never run out of ideas. Ideas have never been my problem. So I have lots of big ideas. The big idea is the general idea for your series. Like we talked about Capital City Murders, a photographer traveling to every single capital to take pictures, okay? Finds a mystery in every single capital. Simple, big idea. The big idea does not have to be complex. It can, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit. It can be a very simple premise, right? Then the small ideas are twofold. There's two types of small ideas. The smaller ideas are the ideas for the book. For instance, the first one in the series is called Overdoses in Olympia. So basically there have been overdoses in the city of Olympia, the first place that Nick travels from Seattle, where he lives, where his home is. It's the capital of Washington. So while he's taking the pictures and stuff like that, he also solves this mystery about these overdoses. That's a small idea as far as that's the idea of the book. The second category of smaller ideas, though, is how does he solve the crime? What does he notice in pictures that somebody else doesn't? And what's the mechanics of those, each idea chapter by chapter? How do we lay clues that the reader can pick up on? How do we set up that book so it's an actual story? Those are small ideas. That's the biggest difference between big ideas and small ideas. Where writers run into trouble in series is in those small ideas. Either a book stalls because they run out of the small ideas for that book, or the series stalls because they run out of book ideas. They have a big overall idea, but they're like, what happens next? What happens in book 2? This is a common thing in trilogy. It's why in your novel, you'll often hear people talk about the sagging middle, the middle of your novel, where it basically comes down and it sags and you're like, oh no, I don't know what's happening. And then you figure it out and it goes back up towards the climax. But that middle part is just like a journey to get the characters from one place to another. And it tends to be, in some cases, kind of dull. And we always talk about in rewriting how you want to prop up that sagging middle, right? The same thing happens in series with trilogies, especially. The middle book of a trilogy tends to be the sagging middle of the series because you're trying to get your characters from this big idea you've got a book 1 to the big idea you've got a book 3. And this middle book is just a bridge. And it's more difficult to write than the 2 books on either end. Okay, so that's where you run out of small ideas there of how to make this particular book and this particular part of the series exciting. Okay, you don't have to do that. We're going to talk about, with some planning, you can plan what those ideas look like ahead of time so that you don't run out of steam. Even in the cases where you wrote a single novel and you decided, oh, this actually could be a series, you put a cliffhanger on the end, like, maybe it could be a series, maybe it couldn't, and you go on to write that. If you do go on to write that, some planning ahead of time will actually help you understand how that series should go forward. So that's the first thing. The second thing we will talk about is themes and plots. So typically, your series will have an overall theme. And the overall theme will be something about, can be anything. It can be related to your genre, or it can be a deeper, more in-depth theme. Maybe the theme of your entire series is redemption, is how this character goes from being a horrible person over here to being a great person over here. And it's that journey of redemption. That's what the theme of the series is. Or the theme of the series can be unity, and it's about how this fractured society comes together and forms a new, more unified society, right? Things like that. There usually is also an overall plot for your series. Okay, the overall plot for your series is kind of what I would call the A plot for your series. It's either the character journey or the overall journey of the plot, or some kind of combination of the two, and often that includes the antagonist journey as well. Remember, when the hero is feeling good and things are up for the hero, they're generally down for the antagonist. So that it can operate the same way in a series. The antagonist can have good books and bad books, and the hero can have books where he triumphs and books where he fails. And you can have an overall series plot that threads throughout the whole series. So you have a theme and a plot for that, but you also have a theme and a plot for each book. So each book has its own theme that probably should fit in with your overall theme of your series, but it also has its own plot and its own plot arc, which also should coincide with the overall plot of your series. The more you know, at least the framework. So some people are going to say, well, I'm a discovery writer and I don't really plot a lot of things way ahead of time. You don't have to have them plotted in detail, but if you have an overall framework of what you think is going to happen in the series and what you think is going to happen in each book, even if it's only a few points, it gives you some guideposts to go off of. And I would argue, and we can talk about that at another time, catch me at BarCon or some other time, and we can talk about how most writers are not pure discovery writers. They usually plot at some point along the way. It's just a matter of when they do their plotting, not if they actually plot or not. But you need both things. You need themes for the overall series and plots for the overall series, and themes and plots for each individual book. The greater you have those planned out and the greater you understand how they match up, the less likely you are to get stalled, because stalling also often happens when you go contrary to your theme or contrary to your plot at some point, especially in like a middle book, and then that throws off the plot of the entire series. So you have to rework the series to fit with that middle book plot, and that can create stalling and it can create problems. It can also create frustration for you as an author. Now, another thing to consider is how long the series is. First of all, how long the series is. Second of all, how long each book is. Now, it doesn't matter. We see from like the Wheel of Time series and other series, it doesn't matter how long the books are or how long the series is. If you write something that's enjoyable, that appeals to your audience, that appeals to readers of your particular genre, then it doesn't matter how long the books are. It doesn't matter how long the series is necessarily. You can keep those things going for a long time. In the example of Capital City Murders, what we decided was each book would be about novella length, between 20 and 25,000 words, sometimes maybe a little bit longer. And there's obviously going to be 50 of them. There's 50 state capitals. So determining the length of the series was relatively easy. Determining the length of each book was relatively easy. And then we decided, since printing a 25,000 word novella is not really a practical thing, and that's a whole other discussion we can have another time, but we decided that every 5 books, we put them in a compilation. in a large compilation, right? That includes 5 of those books. So usually that ends up being well over 100,000 words. It's a pretty hefty book, but hey, it's 5 different parts of the story, and we put those in a compilation. And then we actually do the same thing with audiobooks. We release an audiobook for each individual book, but release compilation audiobooks where you can get 10 plus hours of audio, 12 hours of audio for basically the same price as you would in like a normal novella. And so it works out really well for those particular things. So that's how we decided upon the length of each book and then the length of the series. And so it was fairly obvious by the end of it, we've got 50 books plus 10 compilations. So we've got essentially 60 works that will appear on Amazon and other publishing outlets and things like that. But in other cases, I mean, we look at, Game of Thrones. We look back to Game of Thrones again. There was a certain amount of a plan for the overall series. Of course, George R. R. Martin never did finish it. HBO finished it horribly for him. If you catch me later, I will tell you, and you've seen it, I will tell you my take on the final episode of Game of Thrones, but that's a whole other. But you can see that it was obviously HBO turned it into an 8-season and hugely epic shows, each episode that showed a huge amount of information in each one. So it doesn't really matter how long it is. It's just a matter of what you know of your readers and your target audience and what they will tolerate for the length of that book and how long they will continue to read through that series. Generally speaking, longer series do better because you develop a following. And if you develop a heavy enough following at the beginning, you get enough read through that a longer series actually will produce more income for you, and they do better as far as on the commercial and the sales side. And often it's also easier for a writer to write them because they're in either a familiar setting or with familiar characters. And we'll talk about those things in just a sec here. But the next thing we're going to talk about is the type of series, because the type of series that you write matters as well. So like, are you going to write a trilogy? Are you going to write a super long series? What are you going to do? And a part of what determines that is very simply your genre. There are a lot of cozy mystery series that have been going forever, and they have 30, 40 books, whatever, and people continue to read them all the time. If you think of the Sue Grafton series, the A to Z, all those different things, there's tons of things out there that have extremely long series. And as we said, long series tend to do really well in most genres. Even if you think about high fantasy and epic fantasy, you talk about the Robert Jordan Wheel of Time, the Brandon Sanderson universes, you talk about all those things. And those long books, even with a long series, continue to sell and they continue to work. So within your genre, you can do that. Now, if you tried to have a bunch of 150,000 word romances, you might have a little bit of a harder time selling those. But if you do a bunch of short rom-coms in the 50, 60,000 word range, you'll probably sell those things all day long from now until, they go out of print or you just no longer wish to sell them. And that comes down to the length of each story matters as well, because that depends on also how quickly you can release them. So it depends on your method of publishing and how often you want books to come out and how fast you want them to come out and how you want to manage your writer career. If you want things to come out faster and more often, more frequently, well, then you basically just have to write shorter so that you don't take as much time to write each book. So the length of the story does matter in like how you're going to release things, how you want to manage your author career and how that works for you. The other thing that matters a lot that people often overlook is motivation. Like, well, how much do you like this book? Like, how badly do you want to write this series? That part matters a lot, because if you lose the momentum, you lose the passion for the series. First of all, it comes through in your writing, and your writing isn't as good. Second of all, you just get really discouraged. This is a tough career as it is. Why make it harder on yourself? But we've also all heard about Arthur Conan Doyle and not wanting to write Sherlock Holmes anymore and killing him off and having such an outcry that he actually had to bring him back and being discouraged because people didn't look at what he considered to be his serious work. Okay, so motivation matters, but sometimes your reader motivation may drive you, and your motivation for wanting to make a paycheck may drive you to do different things with your story. Okay. The other thing is your endings matter. So when Arthur Conan Doyle killed off Sherlock Holmes, partly his idea was, If I kill him off, then I can end the series. It's rather final. Death tends to be rather final. Of course, that didn't end up being the way it was. He had to find a way to bring him back, and that has happened to authors before. If you've read the book Misery by Stephen King, you understand that, Paul Sheldon had to bring his character back to essentially save his life, right? So endings matter. But so if you end a series definitively, it can be an easy way to basically quit writing that series. It can also enrage your readers, so you have to talk about those different risks. But the ending of each book matters as well, because you want that to hook to the next book, because you want your books have to be connected by something. In order for them to be defined as a series, there has to be a connection between each book. Otherwise, it's not a series, it's just a whole bunch of standalones. So if in the Jack Reacher series, if every time it was about a spy, but the name of the spy changed every time and it wasn't always Jack Reacher, then that wouldn't be the same series. It would be a different series. It'd be a different type of series. Okay. So there are ways to connect your books, right? Through character, through setting, and through storyline, and even through history, various things like that, right? But when you're thinking about a series and you're thinking about how long the series is going to be and how big the series is going to be, one of the first things you need to do is check your setting or settings. Is your world big enough to contain this series? So in other words, if you're going to write an epic fantasy, you need a larger, or an epic sci-fi, you need a larger, broader universe. If you're going to write a cozy mystery, it can happen in a small town, or you can write a Murder, She Wrote in Cabot Cove where people are dying like crazy, so we are not sure how they're replacing the population. So, but you have to define that for yourself. Is your world big enough for this series? So that's the very first thing you ask yourself. Is my world big enough to contain this series? And if it's not, the second question is, can I make it bigger? So if you're dealing with sci-fi and you're dealing with outer space, of course, I can make my settings bigger. I just travel to a different galaxy or travel to a different planet or travel something else. Space is a gigantic setting that if I use it properly, I can use the whole thing and make it work very well. Now, if my setting is a single space station that's constantly orbiting a single moon, things like that, you still have whole worlds to play with, but it could be a little more challenging depending upon the length of your series and what you want your books to be about. So you have to ask yourself, is my world big enough? Can I make it bigger? And the other option you have is you can change your world. So for instance, if you're writing a fantasy of some sort and you add an element of time travel, or same thing with sci-fi, you add an element of time travel, you just changed your setting. Each time you change your setting, you can kind of reset and tell an entirely new story in it. In the case of Capital City Murders, what we essentially did was each city is a different setting, right? Every city is a different setting. So as Nick travels, the setting changes every single time that Nick moves around. So our setting is easily big enough for even 50 novellas and this whole series of books, because the settings change every single week. The setting that Nick travels, the setting changes from Olympia to Salem to Sacramento, and there's a route he follows throughout the whole entire country. So we just changed the settings. You can do the exact same thing with your series. You just, when you're planning, check your settings and determine what you're going to do about your settings. If your setting isn't big enough, then how are you going to make it big enough? How are you going to change it? How are you going to make this work for a series? The more about that you've decided ahead of time, even if it's a rather loose plan. I know I can hear the discovery writers just sighing in the background. Oh, I just don't do that. That's not the way things work for me. Look, you can still do it. You can still do it. Just have a general idea of where you're headed and where you're going. Now, the same thing is true for characters. Now, again, different people start different places with this particular type of thing, with planning a series. So some people start with the characters and the number of characters that they have and who the character is, right? And if you're character driven, this is a fantastic way to start determining what your series is going to look like. Now, either you have to cover a large portion of your character's life in some cases to continue a series, or you have to have kind of a static character like James Bond, John Wick, Jack Reacher, where the character doesn't really change. It's more about the plot and what happens, and in many cases about the bad guy than it is about your main character, right? The other way you could make your series bigger is just increase the number of characters that are there. This is often a thing with epic fantasies, as there are huge numbers of characters. If you think of George R.R. Martin, there are huge numbers of characters, and then he just kills them off when he gets tired of them, which is another option, and then adds some more. So often that is something that can work as well. So you can change your character counts and the number of characters and the type of characters you have as you move through to broaden your series and make it so that you don't stall out. If you have a new character, then you have something new and exciting and fresh for you to write. And it keeps you from becoming bored, essentially, or from becoming stuck and not having anything to write about. Now, we're going to make a transition, and we're going to transition from background ideas of characters, settings, how long your series is going to be, and kind of these general planning ideas to something more specific. So we're going to talk specifically, really quick before we take a break, we're going to talk specifically about big ideas. Okay, we're talking about big ideas and the characters involved with those ideas. The character that stays, if you have a character that stays throughout your series. Now, as we said before, the big idea of Capital City Murders was so simple. It's essentially just a photographer traveling around from city to city who discovers a mystery in each one. 50 cities, 50 lengths of 50 books. Simple big idea. Your big idea can be very, very simple. Think about the Star Trek series, the original Star Trek series. What was the big idea? Well, you hear it at the beginning of every single episode. A 5-year mission to boldly go where no man has gone before, yada, 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 yada. And it's reiterated at the beginning of every single episode, right? And there have been spin-off after spin-off and all kinds of things related to that particular series, simply because the big idea was big enough that not only could we operate within that big idea, but then once we went beyond that, we had all these different spin-off series. If you think about all the fanfic that's related to Star Trek and the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of official books that are related to Star Trek, they all relate back to this central idea, basically this big idea. Now, when it comes to your characters, there are a number of things you can do within this big idea. And we're going to explore a few of them really quick. We have to look, what you want to look at in your series is the overall story arc of the series. Now, this can be related to character or it can be related to plot. Now, if you have a plot that's your overall story arc, then you can do different characters and your characters can change and move around and things like that. Or you can have a static hero, kind of like we talked about James Bond, Jack Reacher, those different things. Or you can have a hero who goes through a period of growth. So he goes from being, perhaps the theme of the story is redemption. He goes, like we talked about before, and he goes from being a really bad guy to being a really good guy. And the series outlines that journey of how he comes to that point. Or the series can outline his journey to overcome something from his past or things like that. Or the hero can be a backdrop and a tool, and he can just be what the series is set against. Or you can have the anti-hero story, which in many cases with those, the anti-hero ends up being our hero. If we think about shows like Dexter and Breaking Bad and those various different shows where someone who we should not have idolized, should not have been our hero, and we probably shouldn't have looked up to, ends up being our hero, in the end, because they're an anti-hero, we start rooting for the bad guy. Or in some cases where your hero is the backdrop, the anti-hero story, the bad guy story, is the real meat of the story, and your main character is just the one that solves it and helps resolve the story itself. So there's, but you look at your big idea is basically your overall story arc, whether that's whatever that may be and whatever that may look like for your series. For instance, if we look at the series of Die Hard movies, basically it's just action adventure after action adventure, and the thing that ties them together is John McClane. John McClane is a pretty constant character. He doesn't really change and grow a whole lot. We see some minor growth within him, but for the most part, he's a guy who's isolated on his own and taking on the world because he feels like it's his duty to do so, right? And plenty of series have been written with a constant character, and it can work extremely well. And look at the number of series and the number of movies that have come out of that particular thing. There's also, this is a series by a friend of mine, Kate Robbins, and her series is tied together by the setting, which is the Scottish Highlands. So and the characters that tie it together are really this royal family and the Highland chiefs themselves, right? But it's not the same Highland chief throughout. But the setting and the period in history is what really ties this together and stays the same, which makes these books into a series. So we've got a couple examples that we've looked at. We've looked at, a big series where the character is the constant, but the character doesn't really change, or the characters change, but the setting does not change. The big thing to remember is that you have to have some kind of a connection. That's what makes your series a series. What makes the reader want to go from reading one to reading the next one and the next one and the next one? Is that connection enough to compel them to move through this series? That's the most important thing about your big idea, is the connection. And we're going to look in more detail at the connection in our next section of things, when we start to really get down to some of the brass tacks of planning. Okay, before we move on from big ideas to small ideas, I want to show you what this kind of looks like in the plotter software that I use. So I'm going to kind of walk you through the way I do this. So I've got the big idea, right? And I'm going to show you, this is a section of basically books 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19 for the Capital City Murders series. So I have those mapped out inside of one particular plotter, okay, in one particular plotter file. So I have, under the project tab, you can see the names of the books, that I have these all lined out. I have the names of the books here. I can add covers here as I have covers made. But the main thing I want you to see in this is the timeline view. So I've looked through every one of these different cities, and I've decided what's going to happen there. So what's going to happen to Nick that fits in the overall platform of the story? So what happens to him in Axton, Austin, that relates to the overall themes? And there's an underlying romance that he's developed with this gal named Sandra. So we're following through what's happening with her. And then we're also following through Nick's parents, which is part of what's in his home life, which also gives a different theme and an underlying story, constant story, to these various different books, right? And so I use this for the overall outline of the books themselves. Then in Plotter, I switch to the individual book. And in the individual book, I've got a lot of different things that talk about the novel in specific. Like, how does this novel happen? What is the crime? How does Nick discover it? How does Nick become involved? And what does that look like? And then ultimately, how does he solve the crime? So we've gone from the big idea of the project, which has all of the books in it and a timeline related to that particular project, that shows what's going to happen in the underlying, basically the main plot and the various B plots throughout the series in each individual book. So then as I approach the outline for each individual book, I have a template and a theme and an outline to work from. You'll also notice that in this file, I have characters that I've pulled in, different characters with different pictures. I haven't pulled in all the minor characters necessarily, but I've pulled in the characters so I can look back and reference them and make sure I'm consistent from book to book. Also, in this particular case, I pulled in settings, and I pulled in this one particular setting that relates to this book, but I can pull in whatever settings I would like related to all the books, so I can get the overall big picture of the entire series by going and looking at the project timeline and determining where I'm going to go from there. So what's going to happen in each book? What's going to happen within the series? And what is going to affect Nick that continues to affect him for the rest of the series? Then from that project part, I can look down at the individual books, and I can see the individual timelines and see what's happening in those in each particular book. So I've gone from the big idea to the smaller idea of the book. And then within the book, using Plotter, I can go down to the even smaller idea of what's going to happen in each scene. And you'll see that I have added things to these scenes like goal, motive, conflict, and the various different emotions that I'm looking for, so that as I'm writing, I'm always staying within the boundaries that I have set for the series. So this is how I do the planning stage of things, and then I transfer this to Scrivener and do the writing from there. But before we moved on from big ideas down into these small ideas, I wanted to show you what this looks like in this particular planning software. Now, as I said, you can use any planning software. You don't have to use Plotter. I've seen people do similar things in various sheets on Excel spreadsheets. God bless those people. I really struggle with those type of Excel spreadsheets, but I've seen people do it in Word. I've seen people do this a variety of different ways. But what you're doing is going from your high level series idea, and you're going down and diving in to your more specific ideas as you go, making sure that those align with the big idea. That alignment is what keeps you on track and keeps you from stalling. So in just a few minutes, we're going to go ahead and take a break. But before we do that, I want to review that we talked about basically going from your big ideas to your small ideas. And we talked about the different foundations for that big idea. The big idea that you have related to the setting, checking your settings, checking your characters, and making sure this is the kind of idea that you can make into a series that is much larger and a much broader scope than just a book. We also talked about making sure that if your world is not big enough, that you can make it bigger, or that you can change the setting, and that you have a plan for these things. The biggest thing behind all of these, and the things we'll cover in the next session, is basically so that you don't get stuck, so that you don't stall, so you don't encounter writer's block that's as a result of planning this series. The biggest thing is to keep writing every single day and keep making progress every single day, regardless of what that looks like for you, whether that's a page or a chapter or whatever you're able to accomplish with the time that you have available. Now, in our next session, we're going to talk about those smaller ideas, the book ideas, the chapter ideas, and how to plan those out, even if you're not necessarily a big plotter, so that you don't get stuck. We're basically talking about writer's block prevention, but on a larger, grander scale, because we're talking series, not books. But each series is made up of a number of books, and each book is made up of a number of chapters, and each chapter is made up of a number of scenes, and any one of those things can block you. And we don't want that to happen. So what I want you to do on your break is to think about those things. Think about the things that block you, Think about the things that have prevented you from planning and writing a series and getting that series out into the world in the way that you would like to do that. I want you to think about those things. And then when we come back, we'll dive in really deep with some hands-on type things, some things you can take home with you. I'm also going to give you a resources page. I don't want to give it to you now because I don't want you to use your break to be looking over all of those things. But I'm going to give it to you at the end of the next session. That's going to give you an opportunity to go in, find out the different tools that you need, find the different tools and the different applications that you need, different books that you can read that may help you, that may improve your writing and improve your planning of a series. By adding those things to your toolbox, my hope is that you are able to plan the perfect series to prevent stalls. Thanks for coming to the session. I hope to see you in about 10 minutes or so. Go relax, chat around to some people. I'll be around if you want to chat, and we'll get started right on time starting in the next hour. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you then.